September 1939. War returns to Europe. Within months, the world is engulfed in what would become the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. But while armies clashed on land and fleets battled at sea, another war unfolded high above the clouds, silent, fast, and merciless. The air war over Europe. By 1943, the skies above Germany had become a battlefield unlike anything seen before. The United States had entered the war, and the United States Army Air Forces began a relentless bombing campaign against Nazi industry. Day after day, massive formations of American B-17 and B-24 bombers crossed the English Channel. Their mission was simple: destroy Germany's ability to wage war. But reaching those targets meant flying directly into the heart of Hitler's Reich. And waiting for them was the Luftwaffe. Germany's Air Force was experienced, disciplined, and deadly. Its fighter pilots had already proven themselves in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. Many had dozens, even hundreds of combat missions behind them. Among them were the elite, the aces. A flying ace was a pilot credited with shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft. In Germany, aces became national heroes. Newspapers printed their names. Propaganda elevated them to legends. They were seen as knights of the sky. But the reality was far darker. Aerial combat during World War II was brutal and intimate. At 20,000 feet, pilots could see the faces of their enemies. They watched aircraft explode. They saw parachutes fail to open. There was no room for hesitation, no room for mercy. Each mission could be their last. American bomber crews knew this all too well. The B-17 Flying Fortress was heavily armed, bristling with machine guns. In tight formations, the bombers created overlapping fields of fire, a defensive wall of bullets in the sky. But even that was not always enough. German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, attacked in coordinated waves. They came head-on, from above, from below. They fired rockets, cannons, machine guns. The sky became chaos, smoke trails, shattered glass, screaming engines. Young men, many barely 20 years old, fighting for survival thousands of feet above the earth. Losses were staggering. In 1943 alone, hundreds of American bombers were shot down over Europe. Entire crews disappeared in fire and falling metal. Survival odds were terrifyingly low, yet still they flew, and still the German fighters rose to meet them. For German pilots, the war had a different rhythm. They were defending their homeland. Every incoming formation meant factories destroyed, cities burning, civilians killed. Each bomber that broke through meant devastation below, so they fought fiercely. And among them, one pilot began to stand out, skilled, calm under pressure, precise in his attacks. He accumulated victories in the skies over Europe, 1, then 5, then 10. Each successful mission added to his reputation. But what separated him from others was not just his skill, it was something else. Even in combat, there were rules, unwritten codes among fighter pilots. Some believed in honor in the air. A wounded aircraft, clearly defenseless, was sometimes seen differently than a fresh combat target. Not everyone followed that code, but some did. As the bombing campaign intensified in 1944, the skies over Germany grew even more dangerous. Long-range American fighters now escorted the bombers deep into enemy territory. The advantage was shifting. The Luftwaffe was under pressure. Fuel shortages, exhausted pilots, overwhelming Allied production. Yet the missions continued. On both sides, fatigue grew. Fear became routine. And still, young men climbed into cockpits, strapped themselves in, and trusted that training and luck would bring them home. They did not know that soon one encounter in the sky would challenge everything they believed about war. One German ace, 9 American airmen, an encounter that should have ended in death, but instead would become something no one expected. A story not just of combat, but of conscience, of choice, of humanity high above a world at war. The sky in 1944 was filled with fire and steel, but sometimes, just sometimes, it also held mercy. And that is where our story truly begins. December 20th, 1943. The air over northern Europe is razor cold. Inside a B-17 Flying Fortress, 9 American airmen sit in heavy flight suits, oxygen masks tight against their faces. Frost creeps along the inside of the fuselage. The temperature at 25,000 feet is far below freezing. Below them lies Germany. Their target? Industrial facilities deep inside the Reich. They are part of a massive daylight bombing raid organized by the United States Army Air Forces. One more strike in the relentless air campaign of World War II. The bomber formation stretches for miles across the sky. Hundreds of aircraft, hundreds of lives. Engines roar in synchronized thunder. At first, the mission proceeds as expected. Then the flak begins. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire explode around the formation. The sky fills with smoke and shrapnel. The aircraft shudders violently. Inside this particular B-17, metal tears through the fuselage. One engine is hit, then another. The bomber lurches, warning lights flash. Hydraulic systems begin to fail. Fragments of steel rip through the nose section. The bombardier is wounded. The navigator struggles to remain conscious. In the rear of the aircraft, the tail gunner bleeds heavily from a shattered leg. The intercom crackles with panicked voices. "Engine 3's out! We're losing fuel! The controls are sluggish!" Still, they push forward, bombs away. The aircraft jerks upward slightly as its payload drops. But now it's alone, falling behind the formation. And in the skies over Germany, falling behind is a death sentence. The tight defensive box formation of B-17s was designed for protection. Stray too far and you become a target. The bomber is no longer flying straight. Its side is shredded. Its guns, many of them, are silent. A defenseless aircraft limping through hostile airspace. German radar stations have already tracked the raid. Fighter units of the Luftwaffe scramble to intercept. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rise to meet the damaged formation. In the cockpit of one of those fighters sits an experienced German ace. He has seen this before. Crippled bombers trailing smoke. Easy kills. He advances through the clouds, scanning for stragglers. And then he sees it. The wounded B-17. It's barely holding altitude. One engine completely destroyed, another sputtering. The tail section riddled with holes, pieces of aluminum fluttering away into the wind. He closes the distance. Inside the American bomber, the crew spots the approaching fighter. There is no panic now, only resignation. They know what comes next. The pilot tries to maintain control, fighting the stiff yoke. The co-pilot checks the wounded. The gunners attempt to man their stations, but several guns are jammed, others destroyed. A few weak bursts of defensive fire spit into the sky. The German fighter circles into position. Perfect angle. Close range. One burst of cannon fire will tear the bomber apart. Inside the B-17, one crewman begins quietly reciting a prayer. Another grips a photograph tucked inside his jacket. They are thousands of feet above enemy territory, too far from home, too damaged to escape. The German ace lines up behind them. He can see everything clearly now. The shattered tail, the wounded gunner slumped at his position, the nose section blown open.
Through the torn metal, he can see the faces inside. Young men, barely more than boys. He moves closer, so close he can see their expressions. Fear, shock, but also acceptance. The bomber is no longer firing. It is not fighting back. It is simply trying to survive. The German pilot hesitates. This is war. His duty is clear. Shoot it down. Every bomber destroyed means fewer bombs falling on German cities, fewer civilians dead. That is what he has been trained to believe. He shifts slightly to the side, preparing to fire into the cockpit. But something stops him. He looks again. The aircraft is already defeated. Its guns mostly silent, its crew wounded. This is not a battle anymore. This would be an execution. Inside the B-17, the American pilot braces for impact. Seconds feel like minutes, but no bullets come. Instead, the German fighter draws level with the bomber's wing, close enough to see the insignia, close enough for the crews to lock eyes. The Americans are stunned. Why hasn't he fired? The German ace gestures, signaling them to turn, to head away from the heart of Germany. At first, they don't understand. Then it becomes clear. He is not attacking. He is escorting them. The fighter moves alongside the crippled bomber, protecting it from other German aircraft that might arrive. From the ground below, anti-aircraft crews hesitate to fire, unsure why a German fighter is flying so close to the enemy bomber. The two aircraft, enemies just moments before, now move together across the sky. An impossible sight in the middle of total war. The American crew watches in disbelief. No one speaks. They are alive, but they do not understand why. After several long minutes, the German fighter tilts its wings, a silent farewell. Then it peels away, returning toward German airspace. The B-17, barely functional, limps toward the North Sea. It should not make it. But somehow, against all odds, it does. Hours later, the damaged bomber lands safely in England. 9 men step out on the cold runway. They should have been dead. Every statistic says they should not have survived. But they did. Because somewhere high above Europe, a German ace made a decision that defied orders, defied logic, and defied war itself. At that moment, none of them know his name. They do not know why he spared them. They only know one thing. An enemy had looked at them and chosen not to kill. And that choice would echo for the rest of their lives.
The German fighter banks away from the wounded bomber. For a moment, the sky is quiet. But inside his cockpit, nothing is quiet. His heart is racing. His hands, steady just minutes ago, now feel heavy on the controls. He has just done something unthinkable. In the middle of World War II, he refused to shoot. The pilot's name is Franz Stigler, a seasoned fighter ace in the Luftwaffe. He has already flown dozens of combat missions. He has shot down enemy aircraft. He understands the cost of hesitation. He also understands the rules. German fighter pilots were under immense pressure in late 1943. Allied bombing raids were increasing. German cities burned under relentless air attacks carried out by the United States Army Air Forces and the RAF. Every bomber that made it home meant more destruction tomorrow. Stigler had been trained to stop them at any cost. And on December 20th, 1943, he had the perfect opportunity. The crippled B-17 drifting through the sky was practically defenseless. Shooting it down would have been easy. It also would have added another victory to his record, bringing him closer to one of Germany's highest military honors. But something inside him resisted. Years earlier, one of Stigler's commanding officers had told him something he never forgot. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. It was a code of honor passed down among some fighter pilots, a belief that even in war there were limits. As Stigler pulled alongside the American bomber, he saw something that changed everything. The tail gunner was badly wounded. The fuselage was torn open. He could see men inside, helpless. They were no longer combatants in that moment. They were survivors. And Stigler made a choice, not as a soldier, but as a human being. He positioned his Messerschmitt beside the B-17 and motioned for the pilot to turn toward the coast, away from German air defenses. He escorted them across hostile territory. If another German pilot had seen him, they might have assumed he was finishing the kill. If anti-aircraft gunners noticed, they might hesitate, confused by the strange formation. But if his superiors discovered the truth, he could face court-martial, even execution. The Nazi regime did not tolerate mercy toward the enemy. For Stigler, this was not just a split-second emotional decision, it was a risk that could cost him everything. Back inside the B-17, pilot Charlie Brown could hardly believe what he was witnessing. He had expected to die. His aircraft was shattered, his crew wounded, his guns barely functional. When the German fighter first approached, he braced for impact. Instead, the enemy flew beside him, not attacking, protecting. Brown locked eyes with the German pilot through the canopy. No words were exchanged, but the message was unmistakable. You are beaten. Go home. For several long minutes, the two aircraft flew together, an American bomber and a German fighter, enemies by every definition, suspended in a strange silence above a world at war. Stigler stayed with them until they reached the edge of German-controlled airspace. Then he did something extraordinary. He raised his hand in a small salute, a gesture of respect, one airman to another, and then he turned away. When Stigler landed back at his base, he said nothing. He did not report the encounter. He did not claim the victory. He kept the moment to himself. In Nazi Germany, compassion toward the enemy could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, betrayal. So he carried the memory alone. Meanwhile, Charlie Brown and his crew returned to England. Debriefing officers asked what happened. Why hadn't the German fighter shot them down? Brown made a decision of his own. He did not report the mercy. He did not want the German pilot hunted down and punished. So the story remained a secret on both sides. Two men, two enemies, bound by a silent agreement. The war continued. Bombers still fell from the sky. Cities still burned. Friends still died. But somewhere in the chaos of 1943, an unspoken line had been drawn. Franz Stigler had chosen honor over hatred, conscience over orders, humanity over victory, and he would live with that choice for the rest of his life. Years later, Stigler would admit that in that moment he simply could not shoot. He later said that attacking the crippled bomber would have felt like shooting at a parachute. It wasn't combat anymore. It was something else. The skies of World War II were filled with violence, but on that December day, they also carried something rare: mercy. Stigler could not have known that the young American pilot he spared would one day search for him. He could not have known that their brief encounter would become one of the most remarkable stories of the war. All he knew was this: he had seen the enemy's face, and he had recognized himself. In war, nations fight, governments command, but in the cockpit of a fighter plane, alone at 25,000 feet, the decision is personal. And on that day in 1943, a German ace made the most impossible decision of his life.
The war ends in 1945. Germany lies in ruins. Europe is shattered. Millions of dead. And the skies that once roared with engines grow silent. For former American bomber pilot Charlie Brown, life moves forward. He returns home, builds a career, raises a family. But there is one memory he can never shake. A damaged B-17, a German fighter sliding into position behind him, the certainty of death, and then mercy. For decades, Brown tells almost no one. The story feels unreal, like something imagined in the trauma of war. And besides, who would believe it? A German ace sparing an American bomber? It sounds like fiction. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Franz Stigler survives the collapse of Nazi Germany. He had continued flying missions after that December day in 1943. He had seen friends die. He had watched his country crumble. After the war, like many former Luftwaffe pilots, he faced uncertainty and hardship in a devastated Germany. Eventually, Stigler emigrates to Canada. He builds a new life. He does not speak often about the war, and he never speaks publicly about the bomber he spared. For more than 40 years, the story exists only in the memories of two men, separated by an ocean. Then, in the 1980s, something changes. Charlie Brown cannot let it go. The older he gets, the more that single encounter weighs on him. He begins to wonder, who was that pilot? Why did he spare us? Is he still alive? In 1986, Brown decides to try to find him. It seems impossible. There were thousands of German fighter pilots during World War II. Records are incomplete, names are lost. But Brown starts writing letters. He contacts veterans organizations. He places notices in reunion newsletters. He describes the date, December 20th, 1943. The location, Northern Germany. A crippled B-17. A German fighter that refused to fire. Months pass. Then one day, Brown receives a letter. It begins simply, "I was the one." The letter is signed, Franz Stigler. In his response, Stigler describes the exact damage to the bomber, the wounded tail gunner, the open fuselage. Details no one else could know. Brown reads it again and again. After more than 42 years, the mystery is solved. The enemy pilot had a name, and he was alive. They begin exchanging letters, carefully at first, then more openly. Both men describe their memories of that day. Both admit something surprising. They had each chosen silence after the war. Brown never reported the mercy because he feared the German pilot might be punished. Stigler never reported it because he feared the same. Each had protected the other. In 1990, they decide to meet. The reunion is arranged in the United States. Two elderly men, once enemies, prepare to stand face to face for the first time since 1943. The moment is emotional. When they finally meet, there is no hesitation. They embrace, not as former enemies, but as brothers. The cameras capture tears, laughter, relief. They talk for hours, comparing memories, filling in gaps, learning about each other's lives. Stigler explains what he saw that day, the wounded crew, the helpless aircraft. He tells Brown that shooting them down would have violated the code he believed in as a pilot. Brown listens quietly. For decades, he had wondered why he was allowed to live. Now he knows. It was not luck. It was a choice. From that moment forward, their bond deepens. They travel together, speak together, share their story publicly. Audiences are stunned. In a century defined by industrial-scale war, here is proof that individual humanity still mattered. They refer to each other not as former enemies, but as brothers. When asked why he spared the bomber, Stigler once said,
I saw them as men, not as enemies. And Brown would later say, he gave me back my life. In the final years of their lives, they remain close, calling each other, visiting when possible. Two veterans bound not by shared nationality, but by a shared moment of mercy in the sky. When they pass away, just months apart in 2008, they're buried in different countries, but their families honor the friendship that began in war and ended in peace. A German fighter ace, an American bomber pilot, once separated by ideology, uniforms, and gunfire, now united by one extraordinary decision. In the darkness of war, it is easy to believe that humanity disappears. But sometimes, in a cockpit at 25,000 feet, one choice can outlive the conflict itself. And in this case, that choice turned enemies into brothers for life.
War is often remembered in numbers. Battles fought, cities destroyed, millions dead. In the vast scale of World War II, one damaged bomber and one fighter pilot might seem insignificant, just a single moment in a sky filled with violence. But history is not only shaped by grand strategies and massive armies. Sometimes it is shaped by one decision. High above Germany in December 1943, Franz Stigler made a choice that went against everything war demanded of him. He chose not to fire. He chose not to kill. And that decision allowed Charlie Brown and 8 other young Americans to return home. 9 lives continued. Families were built. Children and grandchildren were born. Entire futures existed because of a moment of mercy. For decades, their story remained almost unknown. No medals were awarded for compassion. No headlines celebrated restraint. But when Brown and Stigler reunited in the late 20th century, their story began to spread. Audiences across the world were stunned. In a conflict defined by brutality, here was proof that humanity had survived, even in the cockpit of a fighter plane. Their friendship became a symbol, not of politics, not of ideology, but of personal honor. They spoke at events together. They stood side by side, an American bomber pilot and a former Luftwaffe ace, telling young generations that even in war there are choices, and those choices matter. Stigler never described himself as a hero. In fact, he rejected the word. He insisted he simply followed his conscience. He believed that if he had shot down that crippled bomber, he would have carried the weight of it for the rest of his life. Instead, he carried something else: peace. Charlie Brown often reflected on the improbability of survival that day. By every military standard, his aircraft should have been destroyed. The B-17 was shredded. The crew was wounded. They were alone over enemy territory. But instead of becoming another statistic, they became witnesses to something rare: an enemy who saw them not as targets, but as fellow airmen. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. In war, what defines courage? Is it pulling the trigger, or is it knowing when not to? The skies over Europe during World War II were filled with hatred, fear, and duty. Young men were trained to destroy one another before they were even old enough to fully understand the world. And yet, in that violent environment, a single act of restraint created a lifelong bond. When Brown and Stigler died in 2008, just months apart, many noted the timing. It felt symbolic, as if the bond forged in the sky had endured until the very end. 2 former enemies, 2 old men, connected by a few minutes of shared flight in 1943. Their story reminds us that war is fought by individuals. Individuals with fears, with doubts, with moral lines they must decide whether to cross. Governments declare wars, armies execute them, but humanity survives or disappears in personal decisions. Franz Stigler could have fired his weapons that day. No one would have questioned it. He would have been praised, perhaps decorated. Instead, he risked his own safety and career, not for glory, but for honor. Charlie Brown could have reported him after the war. He could have told the story in a way that brought scrutiny or punishment. Instead, he chose silence. Both men protected each other long before they ever exchanged names, long before they shook hands. Their actions suggest something profound. Even in the darkest chapters of history, the individual still has power. Power to destroy or power to spare. Today, as we look back on the vast devastation of World War II, it is easy to focus on the scale of tragedy. But perhaps it is just as important to remember the small lights that remained. A German fighter escorting an American bomber, a silent salute in the sky, an unspoken agreement between enemies, and a friendship that lasted a lifetime. Because sometimes the most powerful victories are not measured in enemies defeated, but in lives saved. And in December 1943, above a continent at war, one German ace saved 9 Americans. One of them became his brother, and together they proved that even in war, humanity can still win.